I hate to do this, but if you would be willing to sort of shift, I'm not going to ask you to come forward because that'll never happen, but if you would be willing to shift over to your left, that way as people come in from that side, they can slip in and not disrupt everybody. That would be great. Super. Thank you very much. I want to just say a word of welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Latin America program. My name is Eric Olson. I'm the Associate Director of the Latin America program. And it's our pleasure to organize this event on the upcoming elections in Honduras, the presidential and elections for the National Congress. And it's just over a week away, a week from this Sunday on November 24th. Normally, as you all know in this town, it's pretty hard to get anybody to focus on Latin America. There's always so many crises in the Middle East and other parts of the world that Latin America is often the forgotten part of the world. And when it comes to discussions on Latin America, Honduras is even further down the totem pole. More attention given to Brazil and Mexico and other big countries. But I'm thrilled that we were able to do this panel on Honduras. Honduras is a place of particular interest to me since I lived there in the mid-1980s, and I feel a personal connection to a country that for many people is kind of a small, forgettable place. It's the fourth poorest country in the hemisphere. It is now considered one of the most violent countries in the world with an elevated homicide rate of over 80 per 100,000, 4 times higher than Mexico. And there's a lot of things that, you know, are difficult and a challenge in the Honduran context. So in some ways, maybe we could say, what is the, importance of another presidential election in a place like Honduras? Why should we care? What's really at stake in this small, poor, isolated country in our hemisphere? I think there are some very good reasons why we should care about Honduras. Maybe one of them is that Honduras has become one of the main links in the chain of organized crime and drug trafficking from South America to the United States. The U.S. estimates that 87% of drug flights land in Honduras, maybe as much as 70% of all cocaine transits through Honduras. So there's clearly some issues of concern to us. Hondurans emigrate, and increasing numbers are leaving their country because of difficult economic and security situation there. So it's having an impact not only in their country, but also the region, Mexico, and ultimately the United States. We've assembled today a panel of experts, seasoned analysts, people with a long history of analysis on democracy, political developments, and Central America. And so together, I think they will help us discern and figure out what are the issues at stake in Honduras, why we should care about it, and what we can expect going forward. None of them have said that they're going to predict the winner, although James might if you insist enough. But I do think they can help us put this in a broad context and help us understand what are the issues and what are the challenges Honduras is facing as it heads to its election. We're going to start today's panel with Jim Schweigert. Jim is just back from Honduras, and so has some very recent information and analysis from the work he does in his organization. He's from the National Democratic Institute, directs their program in Latin America and the Caribbean, and they have an extensive program in Honduras, as I say, which he will help describe. He's also been a career diplomat, worked with the State Department and many embassies in Latin America and Europe. He was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Southeast and Central Europe, and was on the staff of the former chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Representative Dante Fascell of Florida. Next, we'll hear from James Bosworth, someone that many of us know as Boz. He will give us his assessment of the broader political landscape in Honduras, the key issues being debated in the campaigns, and what we might expect going forward. Again, maybe, no, he won't predict the outcome. Boz is also widely known, is also the partner and director of analysis at Southern Pulse, and he's also widely known as a blogger. That's how I got to know him. He has a blogging spot called Bloggings by Boz, and I think I first became aware of his work in the mid-2000s as Honduras went through the political turmoil and coup. He seemed to be a reasonable, objective voice of analysis during that period. And so we're delighted to have Boz on our panel. And I should also say he's worked with the Wilson Center and produced a chapter for us on Honduras on our book on organized crime in the Northern Triangle. After Boz, we'll hear from Ambassador Donald Planty. Ambassador Planty is a senior advisor at the Albright Stonebridge Group, where he advises clients on Latin America issues, and is also president of Planty and Associates. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Guatemala and has nearly 40 years of experience in the private sector and public service at the local, state, and national levels. And he will provide us with his perspective on the issues and the political landscape in Honduras. Finally, and not least of which, we'll hear from Steve Johnson, who currently serves as the Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the International Republican Institute, responsible for developing and managing programs for strengthening democratic institutions and promoting best practices in governance. Steve has been was a senior fellow and director at the Americas program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Western Hemisphere Affairs from 2007 to 2009. He's worked at the Heritage Foundation. He is a retired Air Force officer, a pilot, military attaché, and a member of the Air Force Reserve. So we have an excellent panel with a lot of experience, diversity of views, and we look forward to hearing from them. We'll each speak briefly, 10 to 12 minutes, and then we should have plenty of time for audience questions and participation. So thank you very much, and I turn it over to Jim.
Okay.
You're welcome to stay here or there, whatever is comfortable for you, Jim.
It might actually work better up there since I'm not a PowerPoint person, but I did bring a PowerPoint because I think it might help to understand some of the issues. Thank you, Eric, and thanks for the invitation to be here at the Wilson Center. I'm pleased to be part of this panel and have an opportunity to talk a little bit about the Honduran election. And if I can get this going, just go like this, or do I need to?
You just need to click on the, hold on, sorry, I think it's open here. There we go, and then slideshow from beginning. You want it at the beginning, right?
That's right. So what I'd like to do is talk briefly about the stakes in this particular election, say a little bit about NDI's role so you have a sense of what's informing these views, strengths and challenges for Honduras 9 days now before this election, and what you might look for on election day to try and get a sense of how the process is going, and then lay out some concerns and some ideas about the day after. So, advancing here. What's at stake? This is really the first test of political power since the coup in 2009. Because although there were elections in 2009, these elections are the first elections in which the full political spectrum of Honduras will participate. The political crisis which preceded the 2009 coup extended after the 2009 elections, after Pepe Lobo took office in 2010, and it really, in my view, was only subsided after the Cartagena Agreement in May 2011, when deposed President Mel Zelaya returned to the country, resumed his political life based on some changes that were made in the Honduran Constitution and the commitment of Zelaya and many of those around him to pursue their disagreements through the political system in Honduras. So there's a new measuring that's going to take place in these elections. And these are general elections. Every elected office in the country is at stake: the executive, the legislative, the municipal. Some in Honduras, no doubt, view this as a zero-sum game. And should the political confrontation between Zelaya and his supporters and the traditional parties escalate, there's going to be obviously a negative impact on governance in the country. And a political crisis could emerge, and any political crisis would handicap Honduras' ability to grapple with the already severe fiscal and security challenges the country faces. But even if the political confrontation stays at a simmer, the next president will govern with less than a majority popular support, if you believe the polls, and I think the polls are correct in reflecting a new situation in Honduras. You have 4 strong candidates, according to the polls, and it is extremely unlikely that any of those candidates will win with more than 30% of the vote or something thereabout, which means that we'll be looking at an even more fragmented political system after the election. Most observers in Honduras continue to see this election as bringing about an end to bipartidarismo, the two-party dominance of Honduran politics. And that is due to the split within the Liberal Party, which was solidified last year in the strong showing of former President Zelaya's wife, Xiomara, and her faction within the new Libre Party internal elections that took place a year ago. This election will let us know if the voters agree that the two-party system is really history. And besides Libre, there are 3 more new parties that have joined the mix. And of these, the most important is the party of Salvador Nasrallah, the anti-corruption parties. Polls have shown that Nasrallah is running strong, and he has tapped into what is a widespread disaffection of young people and widespread discontent with the political class. Were it not for Xiomara Nasrallah, I think Liberal Party candidate Mauricio Villeda would look like a sure bet to win. And instead, we have a real horse race here. And no, I'm not going to predict who's going to win, but I would caution that the polls, which showed a technical tie between National Party candidate Juan Orlando Hernandez and Xiomara, are just that, polls, a snapshot of what was taking place at that particular time. And whoever wins is going to have to deal with a fiscal crisis, a security crisis, and what is declining confidence in Honduran institutions and Honduran democracy. And the conduct of elections will no doubt affect that. The Latino Barometro polls that have just come out on support for democracy rank Honduras among the lowest in Latin America. And it's not just a question of one poll, but if you look at the trend on election participation, it has been downward since 2005 when Mel Zelaya was elected president. So before turning quickly to the conditions on November 24th, let me give you a sense of what NDI has been doing in Honduras. Our first programs were in 2008, 2009, a very tumultuous period when NDI took the decision to stay engaged after the coup and support increased measures for election transparency based on our belief and the Honduran civil society organizations with whom we were working that to stand by the sidelines in such a divided country was not an option. Bad elections could only have made the political crisis in the country worse. So then we supported what was Honduras's first independent systematic election observation and quick count. A quick count is not a boca de urno or a poll-based way of providing a check on the election count by the electoral authorities. It is a parallel vote tabulation using statistical projections based on a random sample of individual polling station official results. And it's been tested and used all around the world and provides a very reliable check on what takes place on election day and can be a very strong deterrent to fraud. So I'd be happy to talk about what happened in 2009 if people are interested, but let me move on to this election. We did open an office in Tegucigalpa shortly after the Cartagena Agreement, and we began facilitating democracy dialogues, working across the board with pro-coup, anti-coup sectors within the country. We expanded our work, been working with political parties, civil society groups, representative of the full spectrum of Honduran opinion, with the emerging new parties as well as with the traditional parties. We've also been working on trying to increase the degree of citizen participation into the construction of public policies dealing with the security challenges in the country. Now that work continues, but for the past year we have focused a great deal on elections, and we've done that with support from international donors, from USAID, from the National Endowment for Democracy, in partnership with other actors, with support also from the State Department, Democracy, DRL. And we have been working on a variety of issues that were identified as problem areas. We did the first independent audit of the voter registry. There are copies of that outside in Spanish and English if anybody's interested, to identify shortcomings and recommend improvements. And in fact, a number of the recommendations in that report have been implemented. We've been supporting civil society efforts to monitor the election campaign, not just what happens on the day of the election, but what happens before. And we've been focusing on key problem areas, the issue of violence, the lack of regulation on campaign financing, issues of vote buying, and low levels of participation of women. We've sought to support more substantive campaigns and debate over public policy alternatives through candidate forums that have taken place both at the presidential and local levels. And to encourage new voters to participate, we're supporting a nonpartisan youth get out the vote activity. We've also worked together with the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy as a technical secretariat for a new mechanism that brings together representatives of all of the political parties in the upcoming election to discuss their agreement and how to implement it on minimum guarantees for elections. And once again, we will be providing technical support to support Election Day observation by a Honduran group, Hagamos Democracia, and to carry out a quick count on Election Day. Hagamos Democracia is a consortium. It brings together groups that are broadly representative of Honduran public opinion views across the board. It has a Caritas, the social action arm of the Catholic Church, has representatives from the Evangelical Church Co-Fraternity, has another group, FOPRIDE, that has more than 80 civil society organizations, and then a private university, the Metropolitan University. So Honduras is heading into these elections with a number of improvements, incremental improvements over past elections. Unlike 2009, when candidates that were selected in the 2008 primaries the year before refused to participate out of their concerns about the coup, this election offers the voters a full range of political options. Civil society in Honduras is also, I would say, fully mobilized, active in many, many ways to promote transparency in the electoral process and to promote accountability by current and future authorities. Now, while there have been no candidate debates, the way we understand candidate debates here in the United States, multiple candidate forums have taken place on different issues of concern to the electorate, offering voters a genuine opportunity to compare and evaluate the candidates and their proposals. And as I alluded to earlier, there have been reforms to improve the use of the voter registry, the National Registry of Persons responsible for issuance of identity cards that are required for voting, but whose issuance is a basic human right, have in fact taken steps to ensure delivery of hundreds of thousands of cards to young people who have become eligible for voters and those who have not had cards before. And this reform has helped depoliticize the issuance and delivery of cards, which was previously handled by political parties. You also have experienced election authorities, the TSE, which has also embraced a strong commitment to the presence of international and national election observers. And on election day, there will be strong delegations from the OAS and the European Union. And the TSE has also established a new mechanism, consultative mechanism, to give a voice to the full range of political parties participating in these elections. But despite the TSE openness to observation, it's a fact, and repeated public opinion polls show this, that there is scant confidence in the impartiality of the TSE on the part of Honduran citizens. And this is a consequence, to a large extent, of what happened in last year's primary elections, where losing candidates for the national and liberal parties refused to concede, claimed fraud, and the public now, I would say, has been conditioned to expect the worst. Part of the issue here is that the Honduran electoral system is not independent and autonomous branch of government, as in many countries, but it's a hybrid system. It's run by political parties, and it's dominated by the national and liberal parties. As one TSC insider put it, the Honduran elections are run by a centaur. The head is the TSE, but the body is the parties. And the TSE and its bureaucracy organize and prepare the election materials. They deliver the materials to electoral tables where the people who run the elections are representatives of the political parties who are in the elections. So if each party representative at the voting tables has to tally the results and one party cries fall, how does one adjudicate the issue when all parties, in fact, have their own self-interest? And election reforms were carried out earlier in 2004 to make clear that the TSE magistrates should not be representatives of political parties, but ask a Honduran and they'll tell you what are the colors of each one of those magistrates in the TSE. In fact, the major new parties, Libre and the PAC, have complained that the TSE simply ignores their complaint despite the new consultative mechanism. So on top of these systemic challenges, Honduras is also, as everyone knows, afflicted by epidemic levels of criminal violence, has huge problem of impunity and corruption, and continued human rights concerns. And this is all at a time of increased influence by organized crime. 20 homicides occur a day. We're supporting our civic partner, IUDPAS, from the National Autonomous University of Honduras, to try and track electoral political violence. But 20 people die every day in Honduras from violent crime. So this is the backdrop against which these elections are taking place, with little transparency, little requirements to report anything in terms of the sources of the money going into the campaign. And I think this will be an issue we may want to discuss in Q&A. So against this backdrop, technical election administrative problems can take on much larger political significance. And I want to flag just very quickly 2 technical issues that could seriously complicate November 24th. First, that's the ability of the voting table election representatives to do their work and to make their decisions together. There are 9 parties participating in the elections. There will be 2 representatives of each of those parties at each election table, 18 people sitting behind the table. And that is first, it will be an untested formula. We'll see how that works. Second, the TSE reporting system for preliminary presidential election results is very complicated, really untested, and has been questioned by Libre and PAC as open to manipulation. Many independent observers are warning that it may not work on election night. Now, the ballots will come in through normal procedures, so if it doesn't work, that is not the end of the issue, but silence and a period of time without information will just fuel rumors of fraud. So quickly, and I'll end, try to end very quickly, what should you be looking for on election day to see how this process is evolving? Well, how orderly is the process on the voting stations? Are the 18 members there? Are they working together? Are all parties representative? If there are conflicts, are these serious conflicts? The observation of Agamos Democracia will look at all of these issues, and because it's based on systematic observation and sample, they'll be able to see at what proportion, at what scale are these problems, if there are problems on election day. A big turnout, most people tell me, helps the new parties, but maybe even the Liberal Party candidate. Small turnout favors those with the best organizations, and I think there's no doubt that it's the National Party that has the best organization. So look at that, and are there crowds on election day? Does the TSE extend the voting hours to cover those who are in line? Or are people left in line and not allowed to vote? These are going to be key issues. Honduran law says the count is open to observers and even to the media. Is that respected in practice? In 2009, Agamos Democracia observers were not allowed to go into some of the polling places, and it took the intervention and a public announcement by the TSE magistrates to turn that around. It wasn't a question of bad will or an attempt at manipulation. It was a question of people not understanding the rules. So what can happen and what should happen the day after? Well, if it goes in the direction of a contested result, if people claim victory before there are results, it's going to be extremely important that everyone be patient and that they focus on the transparency and process, and that all eyes will be on the TSE and how it carries out the official count. Remember, this is not a zero-sum game, and people who are friends of Honduras need to convey that message to all the groups in contention. The next government, whoever it may be, is likely to be a minority government. The problems confronting the country are enormous, and that government will need to broaden its base if it's going to be successful to govern. And then last, though there has been incremental process, it's clear that there are serious problems, and some of these problems are systemic. To avoid Groundhog Day 4 years from now and to confront the same sort of presentation again, Hondurans have to step up to the challenge of passing a political and electoral reform. There were efforts to do that in the past 2 years. Some incremental steps were taken, but more needs to be done. And there are a lot of priorities that the next government's going to face, but I think we've got to add that to their agenda. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, Boz,
Sure.
you're next. You want to there or here? You prefer
I
there?
can go up there. That's fine.
Doesn't matter. It's up to you.
All right. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks, Jim, for leading off and therefore giving away all of the background information necessary, which is very helpful. I'm not going to predict who's going to win, but I am going to start with some poll numbers because the last official polls, which were legally allowed to be published in Honduras, were about 3.5 weeks ago. and they showed a technical tie between Hernandez and Castro, with Villeda in third place, Nasrallah in a surprisingly distant fourth, being that back in March he was a pretty solid second place. And the Castro-Hernandez technical tie remains, as best as anyone can tell, to this point. There are obviously polls leaked out there that show Hernandez up by 8 and Castro up by 12. Parties like to leak polls that show themselves winning, and they like to use those then in the day of the election or the day after the election to claim that they had won. But in reality, we're probably sitting on a technical tie. That said, the polls still showed some interesting data. Not everything in Honduras is a minority position. First off, we had below 50% turnout in 2009, and even if turnout goes up this year, and it's expected to go up a little bit, it would be surprising if it was over 55%, which means, just under half of Hondurans don't even feel like going out to vote. Now, that's true in the United States as well, so I can't criticize them too much. But there is a disaffection with the political system. The second thing the polls showed is that in spite of Honduras being, quote unquote, the most dangerous country in the world, and it does have the highest homicide rate, people were more focused on economic issues than security issues. So the fact that there are 80 murders per 100,000 people didn't stop the fact that when you ask people what's the main issue confronting your family, the issue was whether or not they can afford their groceries that week. And economic issues, more than security issues, will define why people go out and vote during this election. In spite of Jim's best efforts, there are going to be problems in this election. There have been problems. There will be problems in this election. We have seen about 24 candidates or family members killed in the run-up to the election. Now, some of this may be some of the regular violence that occurs, and that's a sad fact. But many candidates have been targeted for their work. There have been additionally another 12 to 24 attacks against candidates with weapons. Once again, can't tell whether it's general violence or targeting the candidates, but some of it at least appears to be targeting candidates. As we know, in the years since the coup, there have been a number of journalists targeted for trying to report on corruption issues, on issues involving politically controversial topics. And so from that perspective, there is an element of political violence that we have to worry about in the system. Additionally, there are going to be allegations of fraud. We already have seen people who back Hernandez are claiming that the Libre Party is paying for voters to go out and vote. People who back Libre are claiming that Hernandez's control of the TSC is going to cause them to try to flip the election results. Whichever one of those two candidates loses is going to claim that this election is rigged. And that's the post-election climate. That's not a pretty picture. I don't see a scenario in which a candidate very happily and willingly accepts a loss and decides that they're going to work with the next incoming administration in a productive manner. This is cutthroat politics, and it's a set of politics in which whichever candidate thinks that they should have won is going to try to undermine the winner. And that's an unfortunate fact of what the next president faces, on top of the next president facing a major fiscal crisis. The fiscal crisis in Honduras has been going on for 3 to 4 to 5 years now, even prior to the Zelaya coup. It's just gotten worse over time. The government can't pay its bills. There are times when teachers, doctors, government workers are paid late or not paid at all, or because the government quite simply can't afford to pay them, can't keep it. And Hernandez has said that he's going to try to renegotiate an agreement with the IMF if he's elected. Castro has indicated that she will somehow fix the economy, though it hasn't really hurt. I was on Castro's website about 2 weeks ago, and one of the headlines on the website is Castro is the only candidate with a specific platform. And I click on the link, and the entire article is about how she's the only candidate with a specific platform and everyone has a generalized platform, but it actually doesn't name any of the points in her platform, which was somewhat frustrating. None of these candidates are running on a particularly strong platform with heavy details. Hernandez claims a police officer on every corner. Castro has made very clear that her first and #1 priority will be holding a constituent assembly if she wins. But other than those, it's not as if they have detailed policy platforms in which we know exactly what their agenda will be beyond the few weeks immediately after the election. We don't know what a 4-year term of either of these people will look like. The night of the election is going to be rough, assuming that the TSE can put out statements in a timely manner. Even then, it's going to be hard to get 100% of the votes in. As we had talked earlier, it's not clear that they're going to be able to project a winner with only 60–70% of the votes in. In 2005, in the Lobo versus Zelaya election, Lobo was leading in the polls by 8 to 10 points ahead of time. Going into election night, it was pretty much a statistical tie, and I forget how many days or weeks it took to do a recount following that election. It was a very heavily contested recount until Lobo finally admitted defeat and Zelaya was given the victory. That is a likely scenario again. The idea that the TSC is going to be able to declare a winner on election night, I would say, is only about 50-50. It's a close enough election, and I think that the electoral system will have enough problems that each of the candidates could very well declare victory, and the TSC could avoid making that final definitive announcement the night of. So what I guess I would want to end with, to a point, is what do the next 4 years look like? Because when I've talked with people, I've refused to make a prediction. So it's, well, one of these two candidates will probably win, and Vieta remains an outside potential. I mean, one of the problems of not having polls in the final month of the election is you can't tell if an outside candidate is going to win. But if Castro wins, Castro is almost guaranteed to call for this constituent assembly and try to govern by referendum. Everybody within her party has told every journalist and analyst in sight that she is not going to have a congressional majority. They're absolutely certain that even if she wins, she will not have a congressional majority, and therefore she will need to govern through sheer force of will. And she will need to push through some sort of constituent assembly, and she's going to need to get the public opinion on her side, and it's going to be a constitution. It will be enough for Hernandez and the conservative, or in the National and the Liberal Party, to ask, is she following the Constitution? And we're going to see them hearkening back to arguments they made in 2009 during the constitutional crisis there prior to the coup. If Hernandez wins, Castro is going to do everything in her power to tell her friends in the international media that it was largely because the National and the Liberal Party controlled the TSC, and he really didn't deserve to win, and they're going to say this is just a continuation of the coup, and they're going to try to delegitimize the government internationally. One of the questions becomes, and one of the fun analogies becomes, do we take Castro's complaint seriously if she loses? And this goes back actually to the earlier election this year in Venezuela. Capriles lost an election. There were a lot of flaws in the election. There were a lot of voters, a lot of flaws, very close election. Capriles loses, Capriles complains. And a whole segment of the hemisphere immediately declares Maduro the winner of the election. And a small segment of the hemisphere goes, well, Capriles has some really good points. We should hold off before we agree that Maduro is the winner of this election. We could actually see on the days after this election an exact opposite scenario. And we will have to watch whether the hemisphere suddenly takes Castro's criticisms of this election process very seriously, while a small group of countries immediately recognizes Hernandez as the winner. And one of the challenges both for US policy and hemispheric policy, and I would point directly to Brazil in this, is maintaining a consistent position on these elections. We're going to have close elections in this hemisphere. The elections are going to have flaws. Flawed elections do not mean necessarily completely undemocratic elections. Having millions of people go out to vote is a representation of democracy. Being able to say that the election results were 35-35 within a few votes and it was going to be close, that says that the political system needs to show how to share power, not winner-take-all politics. And the hemisphere needs to figure out how they manage these sort of flaws but still somewhat democratic elections, how do you recognize the winner? How do you manage the quite possibly legitimate complaints of the losers? And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thanks. Next, we'll hear from Ambassador Planty.
Thank you, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be here at the Wilson Center, and I thank you, Eric, for the invitation to comment this afternoon on the Honduran election. I'd also like to congratulate you on the comprehensive and excellent Latin American program that you manage here. I see repeatedly topics of interest and excellent panels being held, and I think it's a first-rate center. Of course, you're doing a first-rate job. I mentioned to my colleagues on the way up the stairs that I am currently reading Scott Berg's outstanding new biography of Woodrow Wilson. If you haven't seen it, he won the Pulitzer Prize for Lindbergh, and he deserves it for this book. It's really it's a superior book, and for those of you who haven't looked at Wilson and his life recently, I recommend it to you. He'd be proud of the work you're doing here. I'm happy to try to comment on what's at stake in the Honduran election and the critical issues there for both for Hondurans and the United States. I'm going to focus less on process. The two gentlemen who've spoken before me have covered it admirably, so you understand the process and the pitfalls of it and what may happen, what may not happen. My remarks are going to be more focused on the day after. I like that term because I'm currently working with the SOC, the Syrian Opposition Council, to prepare for the day after if Assad ever leaves the scene. So it's kind of fun to look ahead and try to determine what needs to be done and what's likely to happen in the years following the election. As James said, there is going to be a president. I think even Jim Swigert admitted that. There will be a president, tainted or not, controversy over the election. There will be a lot of process issues and a lot of electoral issues. But it is, in fact, a watershed election that will determine the future direction of Honduras. And as such, it's very important, both symbolically and substantively, because as Jim Swigert said, it is really the first election of all participants since the constitutional crisis of '29 and the back and forth and the reappearance of Lobo. The air has been cleared, and this election will set the tone for the future. The last thing Honduras needs is a constitutional crisis coming out of this election. They have plenty of other things to focus on. And I think with the advent of multiple candidates and wide-ranging new political proposals, including the possibility of a constituent assembly to change the Honduran political landscape, this election could result in a very different Honduras or a very different Honduran government going forward than we have seen in the past. And it could produce a substantial amount of gridlock given the fractionalization that's likely to take place, how the Congress will turn out, and the tug and pull between the parties because of the electoral experience that has been referred to. So I'm going to take a minute to comment on what I see then as the critical issues for Hondurans going forward, really focused on the next term of whatever president is chosen. And of course, I do have to say a word on the electoral process itself because this is one of the critical issues. It's been covered here importantly, but I think it deserves underscoring that it's important for the future credibility of the democratic process in Honduras, and that the incoming government has credibility, that the election be free, fair, and transparent. It's not going to be perfect, as has been mentioned, but if it's a free election, it's fair, transparent, and best efforts were made to count the vote and get it right, that adds credibility to the incoming administration, and that's important. The ability to hold free and fair elections is a sine qua non for democratic governments, and it's an important, therefore, indication of a government that's serious about working within democratic norms and democratic institutions. And it's also important that the election take place in a peaceful environment and that there's no extraordinary violence or chicanery or manipulation of voting results, which only can taint the outcome. There's always some of that, but the less we see, the better. I was mentioning also Guatemala downstairs. I spent some years there as U.S. ambassador, and commenting on the fact that Guatemala, right next door, manages to hold good, clean, fair, free, credible, well-organized national elections, just sort of the opposite of what we're seeing in Honduras. So they'd only have to step across the border and talk to their Guatemala. And Guatemala is a country, as you know, fraught with a lot of problems and a lot of divisions and political fracturing as well. And yet they managed to do this with some success and really haven't needed outside observers or monitors for a long, long time. And there's a reason for that, because the National Electoral Commission is more professional, not political, as Jim has mentioned. Second, the second point I want to make is, while a free and fair election is necessary for democratic governance and credibility of the incoming administration going forward, it is not sufficient. As I alluded to in my introduction, Hondurans are faced with a choice among candidates who have different ideas about what the system of government should be and how democracy might be changed to be perfected. A constituent assembly can be a dangerous thing. No one often can predict what will come out of a constituent assembly. And I think Honduran citizens, as they vote, should carefully weigh the substantive programs of each candidate insofar as they can find them and determine what they are, and try to judge which candidate can successfully address the country's core problems, and that is security, economic, and the social problems in the context of a democratic government, and not someone perhaps who's likely to tinker with the system to the extent that we see adjustments made that mirror some other changes in the rest of the region that have taken place recently, where democratically elected governments have used the democratic process to then alter it or disable it or otherwise adjust it so that there is less democracy and more authoritarianism as the country moves forward. So I think that's a danger lurking there in the background that Hondurans and everyone interested in Honduras should be aware of. It's a country with enormous problems. It's a critical link in the chain up the isthmus from, Panama to the United States, and what happens in this election and then what happens the day after is going to be critically important. It's important that democracy is not a perfect system of government. It's important it not be dismantled and democratic institutions not be weakened or reduced in their effect. Because that also has regional implications beyond Honduras, as we've seen in other countries in the hemisphere, notably Venezuela, where, this all spills over. It will not be contained in Honduras if there's chaos, political or otherwise. It will spill over into the rest of the Central American sub-region, into the region as a whole, and it will affect the United States. So it will reverberate. Now, as we know, I think most of you know who follow Honduras, and from the remarks already, that many of its problems are associated with narco-trafficking and other international criminal activity, coupled with weak domestic security institutions. And if these issues aren't addressed more effectively, Honduras will continue to have internal problems. There will continue to be internal instability, and this will also ripple outward. A weak economy and social development problems have to be addressed, things such as health, education, and welfare. Many Hondurans, the vast majority of Hondurans don't have access to decent health care or decent education. The economy needs attention, although, I read an economic piece this morning, very interesting one recently done, which shows that the underlying fundamentals of the Honduran economy are not bad, and there's been growth recently that's fairly substantial. Part of the problem has been external, and the international economy has been weak, and the consumers for their products have been less interested in them. There's been less less buying, and so there are a lot of problems. But if you look at the the macroeconomic side, it's not as dire as one would think. The fiscal policy needs attention, but these are all things that the next government is going to have to pay very close attention to. And coming in tainted or with a record of violence or otherwise without any credibility is going to make it very hard for the next government to address these fundamental substantive issues. Finally, what does this mean for the U.S.? Well, it means a lot. I think whatever happens in Honduras, this ripple effect, that like waves going across a lake, it will not be confined just to their neighbors in Central America, but of course it will impact the United States. It's certainly not in the U.S. interest that an incoming government in Honduras seek to dismantle or undermine the workings of democratic institutions, that Honduras become less democratic. Also, I've already mentioned the narco-trafficking and trafficking in persons and other criminal activities that take place, not exclusively confined to Honduras, but Honduras is an important center of them, and all of that funnels northward. And I think, in terms of U.S. relations, frankly, the United States can do more to help Honduras. We don't have, in my view, and must have, especially looking forward at what this election might produce, a more holistic policy for Honduras, and I would say this entire Central American area for that matter, and work more closely with the new Honduran government to implement this policy. There's a lot more we can do. We've been lazy, we've been negligent, we've been on the sidelines. We've not been as engaged as we should be. And I would portend to you this new policy should have three distinct components. There needs to be a comprehensive and long-term reform of the security sector. That can be done. We're working with countries in other places to do that. Why can't we do that in Honduras? More attention needs to be devoted to economic development programs, creating conditions that will attract investment. Honduras has a modern now state-of-the-art investment law. They've made a lot of changes in their investment regulations and laws, and it's actually an attractive place for investment, at least on paper. And it could be if some of these structural problems were addressed, more investment would come into Honduras. And the social development programs, improving health, education, welfare, I've already mentioned. Let me just elaborate briefly. I have a couple of minutes yet on security sector reform, because these are all linked, of course, but security underlies everything. We only need to get into a discussion about Mexico and many other places in the world. If your citizenry feels there's no effective, they live in an insecure environment, they can't raise their families to go to work without worrying about their personal security, it undermines all of your other goals. And Honduras' security problems can only be solved through thoroughgoing institutional reform and development, including serious capacity building efforts. This institutional framework is absolutely critical. It's absolutely needed. It's something, unfortunately we don't do well. We recognize that it's needed, but we tend to take, I'm talking now we, I shouldn't say we anymore because I'm not part of we. I should specify the U.S. government tends to take a patchwork approach, what I call filling potholes, approach to the problems here and there, hoping that, the potholes will hold, the highway will hold up, and it never repaves the road. This is an inadequate approach because it produces only temporary relief and does not foster institutional change. So you fiddle at the margins, you train a group here, you train a little group here, but you don't do anything about the institution as a whole. In fact, it can be counterproductive because it raises expectations that are invariably dashed when short-term programs are not sustained, precisely because they lack an institutional framework. I did a program in Afghanistan, put together a judicial security unit for the Afghan Supreme Court. The Afghan Supreme Court, the Afghan judiciary had no security or protection whatsoever. They were threatened, intimidated, killed, not just by the Taliban, but by these international criminal networks. And they were completely vulnerable to this. And over a period of a few years, we put together a judicial security unit exclusively dedicated to the court system, especially the Supreme Court in Afghanistan, patterned on what the U.S. Marshal Service does here for the federal court system. And it worked beautifully because we gave it an institutional home. We made it an institutional component in the Ministry of Interior, had its own personnel system, had its own promotion system, pay system, retention system. We created an institution. And the Chief Justice came up to me at our departure ceremony with the American ambassador and everyone else who's anybody in Afghanistan. And he said, you know, he said, thank you for doing this. He said, it sure as hell beats hiring my brother-in-law. So, you know, this is what you have, you know, an absence of, a lack of institutions that do not bring about change. And we can do it. I mean, the money that we spend, you know, filling potholes can be combined with, you know, other monies that are out there. The EU is a major actor these days. Also, Mexico and Colombia can be involved, and the Colombians have been doing some training in Honduras. These elements can be brought together. Something can be done with institutions, but a strategic plan is needed to reform the security forces, the police, the army, the intelligence services, and create more effective institutions. Training and equipment will be necessary, but train and equip alone is not insufficient. It has to be part of an overall institutional development plan. So why don't I stop there? I just say, without, you know, a comprehensive approach to some of these problems, especially in the security sector, they will continue to fester. I was in Honduras. I mentioned the Supreme Court thing because I had lunch with the president of the Supreme Court recently, and one-on-one. And he said to me, why can't, he said, you know, we've tried everything. My justices are intimidated. Their lives are threatened. He said, we tried, they can't adjudicate in their jurisdictions. He said, we tried bringing them to Tegucigalpa and sitting as a group, you know, 10, 12 of them, and hearing cases, but their families were threatened, and they weren't home, so they were even more worried, and they could do less work because they weren't with their families, and their children and their wives were under death threats. And he said, we have absolutely no security or any protection of any kind. So I told him about the Afghanistan program. He said, we need that. That's what we need to have here. I said, go see the American ambassador, and he'll get it for you. That's the last I ever heard of it. So these kinds of problems need to be addressed, because if they're not, they'll continue to have a negative impact on U.S. interests and erode popular support for the Honduran government, whoever heads it, and democratic government in general throughout the region. So I purposely focused more on policy and political things because I can't compete with these experts here on the technical side, and on the process side, they spend all their waking hours and some of their sleeping hours on these things, and we're fortunate that they do. So thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to take any questions later.
Okay, and then last but not least, Stephen Johnson.
Thank you, Eric, and I always appreciate being able to do the cleanup duties, because it means that I get to pick up some choice morsels or two and consume them myself. I'd like to say that for our part, the International Republican Institute does not have a dog in this fight, other than the fact that Honduras should have clean, fair, and free elections. And like the National Democratic Institute, we have ongoing programs on the ground that do such things as strengthen municipal governance, improve citizen security, try to improve the capacity of the Congress, and transparent budgeting and such things as introduce concepts of digital democracy. But for that to take place, and for those programs to remain viable, clean and fair election is certainly something that is needed. And of course, we hope that NDI and Hagamos Democracia and the other observers that will be on the ground will contribute to that process. What I'd like to do is talk to you very briefly about what's at stake in the elections, the challenges that are faced by Honduras going forward, and also the state of governance in Honduras and Central America. Stability is at stake for two reasons. The hard left has never had much of a voice in national politics, and it feels that now it's time. The center right feels that a win by Libre will take Honduras down the same road as Venezuela. So, understandably, emotions are high, and a win by either side could be contested by the other. The other reason that stability is at stake is because of something as mundane as terrain and geography. Honduras is mountainous, and coverage is incomplete for cell phones, and actors may not come in all at the same time into the capital. And for that reason, it's possible that the quick count and the final count may come out with different results. Now, there's also the possibility of fraud in isolated communities where different party representatives, as Jim talked about, at voting tables know each other, are related, or may be bought off by drug money, and they could skew the results and decide to combine some of their votes. These are possibilities. Not likely, hopefully, but this is one of the reasons that outside scrutiny is something that's very important. Now, if the contest is close, the results obviously could be thrown into doubt by these factors. Clean elections with sufficient scrutiny are essential for Hondurans. Security is another thing that's at stake. Honduras is in the middle of Central America's smuggling corridor for drugs. It's also the greatest contributor of migrants from the region traveling north to Mexico or through Mexico to the United States, seeking employment. Honduras has about a $36 billion economy. That's essential to the American to the Central American market and Central American trade. To give you kind of a basis of comparison as to what that means, Honduras has an economy about the size of Corpus Christi, Texas. But all of these economies are small, and disruptions within these economies could certainly affect the other states that surround Honduras. All of the neighbors have a stake in Honduras's ability to reduce transnational crime, provide more employment for its labor force, and do what it can to educate its labor force so it can be more competitive at home. A clean election is essential then for its neighbors. What's also at stake is specific to certain foreign interests, like those of the United States. Aside from the aid investment in Honduras to help it transition from military rule to civilian elected leadership in the 1980s, the United States has based its Joint Task Force Bravo, as well as some limited counter-narcotics capabilities at Palmarola Air Base. It has search and rescue capabilities, and also the forces at Palmarola support regional military exercises. Moreover, as I mentioned before, Honduras is one of 6 regional signatories to the U.S. Central American Free Trade Agreement. So free and fair elections are meaningful for the continuity of relations with the United States. Now, some of the challenges that Honduras has that it needs to overcome, and I think some of them are fairly obvious to all of us: poverty and unemployment. In 1980, a mostly agrarian society with a high birth rate in rural areas, to support a campesino workforce to work on unmechanized farms, experienced a mechanization that brought change and internal migration of people who worked on farms to the cities, and the country was unable to handle that. It occurred at the same time as conflicts in the surrounding countries in Central America. Now, industries consisted at that time of small family monopolies whose owners were unwilling to contemplate change, and the education system could not handle increasing numbers of youth who needed secondary and college education to be more competitive for new kinds of jobs that would be coming available. Moreover, cultural norms at the time really did not support that kind of change. So the result today is that Honduras has a poverty rate close to 70%, and that contributes to a lot of its problems. Predominance of parochial interests. 30 years ago, the difference between rich and poor was not so great, but as local industries grew, mainly as family-operated monopolies, they failed to generate more employment. Moreover, the country's underdeveloped education system could not have supplied the workers. Thus, you have economic elites that have become more prosperous, but an underclass that has expanded, and Honduras has a big youth bulge, and at the same time, it's failed to progress. Drug trafficking and crime is another challenge that Honduras faces. From the 1980s forward, drug smuggling was a problem with clandestine fields in existence all over the countryside. The Central American conflicts of the 1980s and the peace agreements of the 1990s took precedence over counter-narcotics. During the latter, military police were disbanded and new civilian police forces were established. Honduras was the latecomer in all of this. Unfortunately, the country's political establishment has not been able to get behind the need to establish a properly trained and managed force in the same way that soldiers have been trained and resourced. And this is probably why the candidates are divided over whether to put soldiers on the streets or to invest more in a professional police force. In the meantime, neither police, soldiers, or economic elites are the powers that be in most communities, especially in the rural areas. Rather, they are the drug traffickers. Now, the state of governance in Honduras and Central America. Honduras has a powerful Congress and a weak presidency. It's probably an outgrowth of the Zelaya era. The upside is that it keeps an activist president in check. The downside is that it leads to powerful congressmen and committees that run roughshod over certain ministries, leading to unclear strategies and policies. Now, neither model responds well directly to address citizen concerns. It also has skeletal departmental and municipal governance. Now, Honduras is not alone in Latin America in this, but it's certainly the case there. And drug traffickers love this because local officials can be easily bought. Stronger municipalities and regional jurisdictions that are interconnected to national institutions would go a long way toward keeping crime at bay and involving citizens in the resolution of their own problems. Honduras has one community, only one, that has raised its own taxes and taken control of its national police contingent, thus cutting crime by 20% in 3 years' time. But that is one municipality out of 300, and it is clearly the exception. Regional governance is challenged to varying degrees in the immediate neighborhood. Drug trafficking, crime, outmigration affect all of the Northern Triangle countries. Guatemala, the National Congress, has been at an impasse much of the last year because of a constellation of changing party affiliations and defections, as well as a confrontation between business and NGO, non-governmental organization interests. Moreover, the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, something that has worked very well to curb corruption and also impunity in that country, is nearing the end of its existence and is not likely to be renewed. El Salvador is gearing up for elections in early 2014, pitting a former FMLN guerrilla against the mayor of San Salvador, and then a former president, Tony Saca, who is running against both of them, turning that into a three-way, and it could be a very contentious race. Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua is proposing constitutional changes that would permit indefinite re-election, military officers to hold civilian posts, and give, curiously, the business community a chop on legislative proposals. Costa Rica, the president is being tested by public opinion. And in Panama, May presidential elections could become also a very heated race. In the background, there's new leadership in the SICA, in the Central American integration system, in the persona of the former foreign minister of El Salvador. But with strong personalities poised to come into office throughout Central America and endemic problems in certain countries, it's hard to imagine that cooperation in this body will become any easier. A parting thought, as we probably all know, former President Lula da Silva of Brazil gave a rousing endorsement for the Libre candidate in Honduras' election. I would be very surprised if he and his advisors gave any thought to whether it amounted to meddling in the internal affairs of Honduras. However, it is worth noting that his party has pledged to manage UNICER election observation delegation that will accompany the elections on November 24th. So as much as we are looking at Honduras' elections, South America is also doing the same. Thank you very much.
Well, that was uplifting. Kind of discouraging, I'm afraid. We have time for questions. We have a roving mic. I want to take a second just to recognize, well, she's going to get the first question, but I was going to recognize Cindy Arnson, the director of the Latin America program. You were very kind, Ambassador Plantier, complimenting our program, and Cindy has been the long-term director of the program, so much of that is directed to her. And I just recognize my colleagues, Christine Zano and Meredith Pierce and Veronica Colon, who's been very sick, but helping putting this together. Thank you all for your role. Cindy, you want to ask the first question?
Thanks very much, Eric, and thanks to this panel. My question is for Ambassador Planty, and I was taking fast notes, so I may not have gotten it down quite correctly, but when you were talking, Ambassador Planty, about the need for long-term reform of security institutions, you pose sort of a rhetorical question, like, why can't we do that? You know, why do we just fill potholes and not have? I mean, I think part of the difficulty is that it's not for lack of trying, but for lack of leadership within Honduras. It's not the size of the military aid packages. It's it's the raw material that you have to work with. And I think, I mean, I guess I would differ. I think we're beyond the era where the United States would just go in and sort of impose, what the reform would look like. And I think the frustration, or a good part of the frustration in Honduras, has been the inability to get traction, to make the kinds of reforms that everybody on the panel, and I think everybody in the U.S. government and the Congress agrees, are needed. So I just wanted to put that on the table in terms of the degree of U.S. influence and how much these solutions can be made in this country as opposed to having to come with international support, from the ground up.
Thank you, Cynthia. I think you're absolutely right. I wouldn't take issue with any of that. I didn't mean to suggest that the U.S. would go in and impose, or should, because of course that is not a successful way of doing business for us, and never has been, and that's been one of our problems in the past, I think, going back a long time. And you're right, the raw material there is imperfect, to say the least. I've been going back and forth quite a bit over the last couple of years, and though I've been struck by the degree to which the Hondurans and the Army, police, I mentioned the court, are really hungry for more cooperation, more, not the toys or the the equipment so much, and the spot training is, they don't have any cohesive framework to deal with. They have no strategic plan. There's no one helping. They don't know how to do it, and there's no one helping them with it. They feel lost. They feel a little bit out in the woods and without direction, and they know they need more. And for example, we were asked they were having some problems with adequate protection of the president. There was a very active and very serious threat to his life that had been identified, and they simply couldn't put anything together that was sufficient to protect him. And so they were desperately looking for international assistance. And often they don't know where to turn. I just think there's much more room for us to be creative. And if we got together with our EU partners and others in the region, as well, Colombia, even the Mexicans, we could do a lot more for Honduras than we have done to date. I know it's a tough nut to crack. There's a lot of corruption, there are a lot of problems, and a lot less than ideal to work with. But I get this, from the Hondurans. I had, the president of the Supreme Court just actually practically begging for some help on, how he gets some protection for his judicial system. And he has nowhere to turn. There's nobody who has any money for him. Nobody has any ideas. And I know for a fact he did raise it with the U.S. ambassador. But didn't find any interest on that score. So there are a lot of it's not easy. It's not easy to do institutional change anywhere. Look at the United States. But certainly, I believe a lot more is needed and a lot more could be done. I'm just I went through some of that in Guatemala, and in 3 years we accomplished things that people said we couldn't do, and we started a brand new police force from scratch, fielded a 23,000 person strong police force from zero, essentially trained by the Europeans, and we had a small role. In fact, the Spaniards took the lead and they put up the academy. So I think these things can be done. It's just I'm a little discouraged by, I'd say, the lack of attention the U.S. policy level devotes to these issues these days, not just in Honduras and the region as a whole. It's my own take.
Great. Any other questions? Yeah, there's one in the back there.
Thank you very much. My name is Eduardo Con. I am based in Montevideo, Uruguay. I am the director of B'nai B'rith International for Latin America, and I'm here this weekend because B'nai B'rith is celebrating 170 years.
Huh.
So that's the reason why they told me about this, and I just came in time. So I congratulate you for this meeting. The question is for any one of you. Honduras is weak and poor, and it's not weak and poor for the last year. It's weak and poor for his history. So whoever it wins, do you believe that the influence of the ALBA countries, and more than the ALBA countries, the leader of the ALBA countries, can stain another country in Central America like Honduras?
Good. I'll put you on the spot, James.
Yeah. Okay. The leader of the ALBA countries is having its own financial difficulties at the moment, and I'm less than certain that they're going to be able to finance Honduras's problems, because they probably can't finance their own system too much longer. There is, but it's not just the ALBA countries. I mean, there's an influence from Venezuela onto other places in Latin America, but in reality, my opinion is all politics is local. And whether Honduras succeeds or fails matters much less the ALBA influence than it does whether Castro or Hernandez manage to get their act together. The ALBA influence is, or for that matter, the Colombia influence or the Brazilian influence or the U.S. influence. The U.S. influence maybe matters more than the rest, but in the end, it is the local leadership. And Castro or Hernandez will succeed or fail on their own. In spite of the outside influence, they may point fingers at outside influence to blame some of their problems, and that's a common effort. But it's not. The reality is they own their own problems and they have to fix them.
Steve or Jim, you want to add anything, or Ambassador?
No, I think that's right. I would agree with that, and with a footnote, and that is, outside actors can complicate. They can add. They can throw a bolt into the machinery. Just add complications that the government doesn't need, and that really sort of further complicates the situation and draws the U.S. in a negative way. And it can be, it can be a complicating factor. But I agree with you in terms of it'll be, it's make or break based on what people in charge do. They have to make the tough decisions, and they're the ones who will get Honduras out of its mess with the help of friends, if it's at all possible.
Okay. Right next to this gentleman, and then we have a person up here in front. We'll just take the two questions right now.
Okay. Hello, I'm Niels Hender from the Inter-American Development Bank. I'm just wondering, sort of, if you could give your thoughts on sort of what is the most important, or would you say it's the best way to tackle the security problem? So Mr. Johnson was saying something about like a municipality that took care of its own police finances. So would you say there's any role, for example, for fiscal decentralization to play? And Ambassador Planny, you were mentioning the protection of the judicial court. What is kind of like, I mean, what would you say is kind of the best way of tackling it? Because it's kind of like mutually reinforcing itself with like political destabilization. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And we have a question up here too, Christine.
Hi there, Sarah Danish, International Republican Institute. My question is directed at you, Jim, because you had alluded to campaign financing, but welcome any comments or any thoughts. Could you shed some light on what you see as the scale and the scope of the problem in Central America, and maybe, given the multitude of democratic challenges, where you would place that on the agenda of issues to begin to tackle moving forward? Thanks.
Okay, well, we'll take a couple of responses here, and then we'll come back to Patricia.
Eric, maybe I can talk a little bit about the fiscal decentralization and the security question. There are a number of different communities that we work with, but one in particular is kind of a bright spot, and I apologize if I seemed a little bit negative on talking about some of the weaknesses and challenges in Honduras. Didn't really have an awful lot of time to get into the strengths that you see in different areas, but some of them are very localized, and this is one area where it is extremely localized. And it's one municipality that managed to raise its own taxes for a security tax and then develop a command center for its police force, realizing, of course, that it's a national police contingent that is in the town. They bought an extra police cruiser. They bought GPS units to put in the police cruisers and trucks. They built a police barracks so they wouldn't have to sleep in the jail along with criminals that they apprehend. They are building their own forensics laboratory to investigate crimes. And they put together a command center hooked up with a system of security cameras in their community, and also hooked up with computers so that they can track where the police units are. The citizens themselves take the 911 calls and dispatch the police. And they've come that close to controlling the police. The only thing that would be necessary for them to have total control would be to buy the uniforms and to pay the salaries, but they don't do that. But it is a measure of what citizens can do if they're well led, if they are involved and participate in the civic life of their community. Now, the reason that that is so rare in a country like Honduras, and probably rare throughout the Northern Triangle countries, is because the municipalities have traditionally been very weak. And the other thing is that you don't expect the municipalities to take on that kind of responsibility for their own security. But in this case, they did, and they seem to be doing it very well. Why wouldn't it work necessarily in other municipalities, and why would it possibly not be an immediate model to adopt for the whole country? It's because it depends on individual leadership. You have to have the right kind of people, the right kind of mayor, the right kind of individuals to head up and lead an effort like this to be able to pull it off. And then the other question is, are there going to be people to be able to backfill these positions later on that are going to have the interest and the smarts to be able to continue with the effort? And that's the problem that we all face. We face it here in the United States with our government, and we often experience ups and downs in the leadership that we have, throughout our communities and states and at the national level, and we manage to deal with it. The issue for Honduras is getting to the point where it has an educated workforce and it has the leadership that's available to step in and start to lead efforts kind of like this.
You ask a very good question, I think a very fundamental, important question. And as the IDB is an important, incredibly important actor in the region, there are two things I would like to say. I want to add to what Stephen said, in the sense that there is this, for those of us who spent a lot of time working on policing issues. There is this concept in policing, not universally adopted or in play, but in many very important places, called community policing. It is a set of policing precepts that the end result is of what Steve Johnson has just described. But the theory of it is that, you know, police need to engage the community on a very fundamental level. They need to work with the community so closely that the community is actually performing some policing functions. And this philosophy works because what it does is it produces more confidence in the police on the part of the community. It produces more confidence in the community on the part of the police, because in many cases police don't often trust the community, or they fear that the community is distrustful of them. So it's a mutually reinforcing thing. And, you know, if community policing precepts are adopted sort of as a national policy, depending on the local leadership you get, and as Cynthia said, it does boil down to leadership, a key factor in all this, you can get something like this working on a much larger scale. There has to be a system for doing it, though, and to get it to work on a larger scale. And it goes back to my sort of pothole patchwork analogy. You know, these are great examples of success, but they need to be replicated on a larger level, on a national level. And that takes me to the second point I want to make about the IDB. And that 2 years, I think it was now going back 2 years, I spent a couple of days with the Minister of Interior and the Vice Minister of Interior. And they had money, or were working on, they had some seed money from the IDB, and they were working on getting a more comprehensive grant to do a strategic plan to deal with the security problem in Honduras. And it was a broad-based strategic plan. In other words, define the problem, you know, what is it we need to do to tackle it? What vision do we need to have? What mission, what are the goals and objectives, and how do we get there? And right down to the courses of action. How many community policing units do we want, and where? And it was a very, very concrete kind of planning that you need if you're going to undertake a national effort like this that involves some, you know, change in the institution. They were very into it. They had some good support from bank. I would invite you to find where that process stands. I don't think it has progressed terribly far. I don't know where it is, whether it got stuck for some other reason. But it was an effort that the bank was behind and was willing to commit some substantial resources to it. Right, right. Well, part of it was the strategic plan, and I don't know where that stands, but in this whole, and I've worked with some of the other IDB citizen security. I did a 2-year citizen security initiative program, IDB Finance in Guyana, and believe me, the Guyana National Police are not easy to deal with, and if you can do, you know, sort of a program like this, it was focused on leadership, police leadership, and on community policing, and we had a tremendous success in the community policing area. They wanted to do the program all over again, but there was no more money for it. So these things can be done. It's just that, you know, it needs more organization, it needs more leadership, it needs scale to, you know, this sort of thing should be happening all over Honduras, not just in one community, in my view. That's how you get at the root of the problem.
Jim, you wanted to say something about, or were you going to go, Boz? Oh, you can go.
Yeah, I wanted to respond both to the security issue and to the question about campaign financing. I think, you know, there have been dozens and dozens of studies about campaign financing, and the question of money in politics is always an issue and will always be an issue. But I think it's because of the increased influence of drug traffickers and organized crime in Central America that one has to look at it again, and you have to be realistic about it. Things are not going to change overnight in terms of political practice. Political parties are not going to overnight suddenly become completely transparent about the sources of their campaign contributors. But the issue of the increased influence of the narcos in the region, I think, makes it incumbent upon everyone to work harder on this And it gives, I think, an incentive to political parties to take steps that they have not taken before. Just about a week ago in Honduras, there's a government institute for access to information, and the head of this institute alluded to discussions that she had had with members of Honduran civil society who are trying to track the campaign expenditures, the access of organized crime. And she said, well, in the past, everyone had understood that organized crime, drug traffickers financed candidates. Now they select candidates. You'll hear lots of different things in Honduras about where the narcos are. And one thing that is clear is that this is not a question that is limited to any single party. And that gets to the question of decentralization. And I am not a securities or citizen security expert. We work in the region with civic groups, political parties, and so I'll pass on what I've heard from a number of Hondurans. I think you need to look at how one can take advantage of the interest in local communities to improve their security. That's there. There are things that can be done. We've worked with communities on developing violence prevention plans, and they're desperate to find funding and support for some of these things. That's most effective, I think, in dealing with the challenges that the gangs present. When it comes to the challenges that organized crime and the narco traffickers present, that has a completely different dimension. So their decentralization may not bring the same results. What I've heard from many Honduran friends is the number one concern people have is the police. Which side are the police on? And if you don't know what side the police are on, then you have real issues. And so the question of police reform and how to support police reform, I think is going to be number one. And then the issue of impunity. Until you can deal with the rampant impunity, it's hard to think that you're going to be successfully addressing this issue on the community level. We've all been flagging problems, and Steve alluded to being afternoon downers in a certain extent. I think we need to step back for a second and remember 2009 and 2010. These disputes are being channeled through the political process, and that is a good thing. I expect that although politics in Honduras is a pretty brutal game, we saw the way it was played in the internal primaries. Self-interest seemed to trump any sense of collective interest, even within your own party. But nonetheless, people are acutely conscious of the challenges that the country is facing. And the fiscal crisis is very, very real. The fiscal crisis, I think, gives a certain degree of incentive for people to try and work this out, because I don't believe that people imagine themselves in political power, whichever side you're on. And they are smart people, and they understand that they'll have to govern the day after. So I think that with all the difficulties that we've described, that this process will move forward, and I am relatively optimistic is probably too strong a word, but I believe people will find a way without tearing the house down, and to confront some of the bigger challenges that they're facing in terms of this rising influence of organized crime, which I think is an extremely corrosive issue for democracy in the region. So is it the only priority? No, but I think it is a bigger priority now than it was a few years back. And I also think there's an opportunity there. So I I think there's room for reform on this issue and getting some real buy-in from politicians.
Want to say anything, Boz?
Yeah. On the campaign finance issue, along with organized crime, I mean, obviously, one of the concerns is that Honduras is controlled by 7, 12, 15, pick your number, families. You know, and 12 is usually the number they give in Honduras. You know, those families are largely financing a good chunk of this election, and the good chunk of the media coverage in this election, and figuring out which families control, that was a faux pas, but perhaps was correct. Which families are financing the candidates would be a very useful thing for the system. It's not just campaign finance reform, though. Honduras needs a more robust journalism community in order to do these investigations, whether or not they get their campaign finance reform. Because journalism, that sort of transparency that journalism and the fourth estate push would be vital under any circumstances. And I would say that would be more useful than anything the government could do on that front.
I do think it's worth saying specifically that there's nothing in Honduran law, electoral law, that requires an independent audit of campaign financing. In other words, there's nothing. The law is terribly weak. Now, even if they did independent auditing, doesn't guarantee a clean process either. Let's not be naive about that. But if you don't require anything, and the TSC, the tribunal in charge, admitted last week they have no authority to conduct an independent audit of any of the campaign financing. So that seems like one of those fundamental building blocks of democracy, that if we can't even agree on that and make that a priority, then, you know, that's a real problem. So just to be clear on that. We have time for maybe 2 more questions. Patricia and
Thank you. Patricia Escamilla-Ham, National Defense University. Ambassador Planty mentioned that Mexico could play a role. And I thought that was very interesting, and I would like to ask you to elaborate. What exactly do you mean? What kind of role? What can Mexico do? And if you know if the Mexicans are willing to play that role. Thank you.
you're right here.
Hey, Peter Meyer with CRS. Assuming Castro were to win, how much turnover would you expect in the government? Would sort of working level functionaries remain, or would you see sort of complete a flip of the system? And then if Vieira were to lose, how much sense do you have that the PL would be willing to work with either of the other 2 candidates to sort of form a working majority in Congress? Thanks.
So, Boz, you're our handicapper. You want to try it? I'll let others speak if they want, but I was going to. This is what Boz does.
If Castro comes into power, there is going to be a large overturn of the government functionaries over the course of about 18 months. I don't think it will be a switch flipped overnight. That said, the Zelaya family owes a lot of favors, especially if she wins. And the legacy of the previous Zelaya administration was functionaries being placed as favors to friends and family and donors. And for that reason, I do think that you would see it. I don't think it would be overnight, but it would happen. On whether the Liberal Party would work with either the National Party or Libre, I'm not sure. You actually could see a divide in even what remains of a divided Liberal Party, in the sense that I do know that the Liberal Party has people who are sympathetic to Zelaya and to his friends, and there's still some liberal Libre friendliness. And on the other side, you have the Michelettis within the Liberal Party who would much rather work with the National Party than ever work with the Zelayistas. And so you actually could see a redivide within the Liberal Party and what exists from this point.
Anyone else want to add a parting comment? I mean, Peter, I think that's another one of the issues in so much of the institution building, the lack of a professional civil service career. People are down to the secretaries are changed, and you don't have that kind of long-term stability in the workforce. And that's a real problem if you're trying to build a professional workforce. So I forgot, Ambassador Planty, there was a question for you.
Yes, on Mexico. You'll recall some while ago now, I guess it's probably about 5 years ago, where Mexico announced a very ambitious plan to expand its scope of activities and its horizon politically, economically, and every other way with the countries immediately to the south, with Central America, the 5 Central American countries. It didn't go as far south as the Isthmus of Panama. And the idea was for, and this came about also partly because of finally the end of the internal conflict in Guatemala, which went on for 36 years. And so many Guatemalans had fled the internal conflict and were living in Mexico, mostly in Chiapas. And many of them returned, some didn't. The Mexican government very generously offered them citizenship if they decided to remain, and this was during President Zedillo's time. So the Mexican policy started to look, foreign policy started to look again toward its Central American neighbors, and there was a very big push to engage them more in a dialogue about the range of issues that afflict the region. And I recall that I had left Guatemala by then, but I was back on a visit on one project or another and went to see the Minister of Interior. And he said, I've just come back from Mexico. I said, oh, what were you doing there? He said, well, I went to meet with my Mexican counterpart, with the Mexican Minister of Interior, with the other Central American Ministers of Interior, to talk about how we could exchange information and cooperate and what things we could do, about the criminal networks, the flow, the border problem, the border issue. It was the first time in history, mind you, that a Guatemalan Minister of Interior had sat down with his partner to the north. Mexico is the Colossus of the north for Guatemalans. It's nice to see somebody else has that problem other than us. But and because of the war and the guerrilla leadership was headquartered in Mexico all those years during the Guatemalan internal conflict, the Mexican-Guatemalan relations were not very good. But they're excellent today. And here for the first time, and this were in modern times, you have and all the problems we had, you would have thought there had been some binational cooperation between the two countries on something besides how you end the war and handle the refugees. But the other centrals were also involved. And it was an effort partly to tie into the SICA, the Central American integration process, which had got off the ground a little bit. It gained some altitude, maybe 500 feet. But nevertheless, it was bubbling along. There were a lot of informal contacts going on among the government leadership in the region, ministers of finance, ministers of trade, across the board in these governments. It was actually a lot of activity. And of course, Mexico has economic, trade, and financial interests in the Central American region, and it wanted to expand those. The Mexicans were not in a position to, sit down with the Hondurans and work out a strategic plan for institutional reform, but they were interested in more stability, less criminality, more prosperity in the region, and so they were actively fielding the people in their government. It was moral support, but it went beyond moral support. And Mexico has a very substantial economic stake in the Central American sub-region. So if there was an effort to do institutional reform on a broader basis and bring in like-minded countries, in addition to what the EU's doing, and they're doing a substantial amount, certainly Mexico would want to be at the table. And there is Hispanidad that worked there. There are a lot of things that work there that can be positive. Plus, we're then with others at the table, we can meld in a little better. We're not the big gorilla at the table always. So, these are processes, we need to think more about, take advantage of. U.S. policy, these days in the region, in my view, is ostrich-like, and we don't even think about these things, but they're out there, and they should be leveraged, and we don't do that.
Any pressing, oh, yeah, two more questions. We have a little bit of time. If you keep them short, we'll get the two last questions in.
Thank you. My name is Tatiana Zelaya, and I'm the alternate representative for Honduras to the Organization of American States. More than a question, it's just a thank you to the organization for putting up this interesting panel, which clearly reflects some of the things that are going to happen in the next 10 days in our country. And for sure, we're looking forward for the electoral process. And aside from the panel and the interesting comments, we want to thank you for producing the electoral census document.
Oh, this NDI. Great, thank you.
Eric, could I make one remark on an
Sure.
upbeat basis? Just
Sure,
very quickly
yeah.
to spin off that. Honduras should be congratulated. I work with an NGO here in Washington called the Sabin Vaccine Institute, named for Albert Sabin, the distinguished American scientist, probably the top American scientist of the 20th century, who invented the oral polio vaccine and many other things. And Sabin works on neglected tropical diseases all over the world. And they've been very active in Africa, Asia, and most all parts of the world except Latin America. They're getting more involved in Latin America. And Honduras is the only country in Latin America to have produced a national plan to attack neglected tropical diseases, which are these diseases that have been around forever. Medications exist that can control the diseases. The big pharmaceutical companies donate them. So there's really no cost. The only cost is a country needs to have a national distribution network to get these medications out. It's mostly for diseases that we're familiar with: hookworm, ringworm, onchocerciasis, river blindness. These diseases caused many of them by mosquitoes, but many of them by just ingesting parasites, parasitical diseases. And believe it or not, there are millions of children, and not just children with families, but primarily children at risk. And Honduras is the only country in the region to have produced a national plan and using the education system to get these medications out and distributed, and Honduras will, in the very near future, be able to eliminate all these diseases with the donated pharmaceuticals. So you can do it, and you can do lots of things. I was down there and went out to some of these places and met with the health minister and the first lady, and so this takes it takes a plan, it takes a distribution network, it takes a lot of roll up your sleeves, nitty gritty, hard work. And Honduras beat Brazil. Brazil now has one, but it's still not. So, you can do it. Let's not be so pessimistic.
Good, and there was one other question next to you there.
Hi, I'm Catherine Craigie, and I'm with the Americas program at CSIS. I had a question. Mr. Swigert, you mentioned that there are really 4 top candidates right now, but in the most recent poll that Hernandez and Castro were the leading ones. What if one of the other top 2 of the 4 come up and win in between the time of the last poll and the election? What will be the results, and is that likely?
I don't know. And I think it's, as I tried to allude to, polls are a snapshot of a particular moment. There are a lot of doubts about polling regardless. Boz referred to the fact that all parties have their own polling, and when I was down there last week, I heard a lot of optimistic stories from each of the parties when I would sit down with them. I think it is possible that the situation changes since the last public polling took place. That is entirely possible. What I don't see as possible is that one of these 4 candidates is going to emerge with a mandate. And so that is why the issue comes back to how do they respond. And I think we know that there are problems with the electoral system. There are problems with any electoral system. There's been some progress made since 2009. There's a lot of international observers who are serious, good professional observers who have a lot of experience, the EU, the OAS. There'll be a lot of national observers on election day. And hopefully that presence will deter some bad practices. And then may be a period of not knowing what the results are. And that's where essentially it'll be important that people wait. And candidates declare victory all the time. And I think that'll probably happen just as a preemptive move at the least on Sunday night or Monday morning. But it's important to keep in mind that there's a process for counting these ballots, and then every friend of Honduras who has contacts across the board, and in the United States you'll find there are a lot of contacts with all directions. I think it's keep the eye on the ball as this process goes forward. But it will be an interesting election, and I really don't have any idea who's going to win.
Boss, did you want to add anything?
It would be, it's not completely impossible. It would be highly unlikely that one of the two leading candidates doesn't win. They are the two leading candidates, and it is possible, hypothetically, Vieta has spiked in the polls in the last 30 days, but probably not. I would say a very outside chance. If it were to happen, I think the two leading candidates it would be an ugly scenario. You know, the idea that the Liberal Party somehow pulled out a victory after all the polling stopped would not go over well among a large portion of the other candidates in population. That said, I think it's an outside shot. I think that, you know, the two leading candidates really are the two leading candidates. I think they are in a statistical tie, and it's going to be about who can turn out their voters on election day. And the only thing I would disagree with that was previously said, the National Party has a great turnout mechanism. They're institutionalized. Libre is not weak in terms of their ability to turn out votes. Zelaya won the presidency because he managed to turn out more votes than Lobo in 2005. They do have a turnout mechanism, and so it's gonna be a close election.
Great. Oh, Steve, the final.
Just, actually, I do have the results of the election right here, but,
That's why they call it a smartphone.
right? I'd just like to congratulate the Honduran Foreign Ministry and the Honduran government for making a concerted effort to get international observers to the elections this time. I think the outside scrutiny is something that's going to help, and certainly want to wish Hagamos Democracia and NDI in their effort every bit of luck in doing this. And certainly it's going to be an interesting day, interesting night, and probably a couple of very interesting days following that.
Great. Well, join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you all for coming out on a Friday afternoon.